Hello, everyone. This is the webinar series for the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Work Group of the National Water Quality Monitoring Council. Please take a minute as we get started here to connect and share with us where you are joining from in the chat. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sylvia Lee. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a biologist at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency based in Washington, D.C. Currently, I'm working remotely from the traditional lands of the Apalachicola in the northern part of Florida. I'll be putting some links in the chat for you to check out if you want to learn more about the council and stay connected with the JEDI work group. The National Water Quality Monitoring Council is committed to promoting justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within all aspects of water quality monitoring and assessment. Our success in achieving water quality goals depends on learning from people of all backgrounds. We're committed to fostering an inclusive and respectful culture for all participants and actively improving JEDI throughout council activities by working aggressively to remove systemic and institutional barriers that add layers of disadvantage and environmental injustice to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ+ communities, persons with disabilities, and other minoritized groups. We acknowledge that our initiatives are a work in progress and commit to training and educating our members on implicit biases and historical environmental injustices so that we may continuously improve how we amplify underrepresented voices and support opportunities for the broader water quality monitoring community. I'm pleased today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mark Edlund from the Science Museum of Minnesota. He's a senior scientist at the St. Croix Watershed Research Station. And I'm very fortunate to know Mark since I started graduate school, and he's been a great mentor to me about all things diatoms. Thanks for joining today, Mark, and please take it away.
Get my screen shared. There we go. Nick, nod if you can see that okay. All right, good enough. All right, thanks for that very kind introduction, Sylvia. And let me start by saying good afternoon, bonjour, bonjour, which are just some of the greetings that we use when we live on and play on and work on lakes and lands and places that we visit. Today I'd like to explore with you some really what I consider amazing partnerships that I get to be part of in addressing water quality issues in some of our largest inland lakes in our continent. Before I go any further though, I want to say thank you. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today, but as with so many things in water quality, it takes a whole bunch of people to do this. And so I want to thank both funding agencies as well as students, co-authors, collaborators, partners that I've been able to work with together to help address these water quality issues that we have in so many of our water bodies. I want to just start by saying that I probably come at this from a very different perspective from most people. I work for the Science Museum of Minnesota, which is a nonprofit public exhibit museum that's located in downtown St. Paul. However, most of the times where I hang my hat, it's out at a research station that's located about 35 miles away on the banks of the St. Croix River. At the research station, we have a a great group of people who address environmental issues surrounding water quality, watersheds, and do a lot of work with historical reconstructions of environments. So for today, what I'd like to do is, in addition to saying thanks, I want to talk just a little bit, since we are addressing the National Water Quality Monitoring Council, I want to make sure we talk a little bit about water quality and the perspectives that I come at it from, which are from diatoms and paleolimnology. Then I want to talk about how we've worked to develop partnerships to solve some of these big lake problems. I want to highlight two of the problems. I've got them in the wrong order. I'm going to talk about Lake of the Woods first and Red Lake second. And then I want to move on to sort of some things that seem what I've learned over the years and how we can most successfully work in partnerships. And then last, I hope we have some opportunity to have some good discussion at the end of things. So I come at water quality from a diatom perspective. I don't work on too many streams. I work on lakes, and diatoms are, as most people know, are one of the most important organisms in the whole wide world. They're found in any place you can find water. They're important from sort of an ecological standpoint in terms of carbon fixation and photosynthesis on the earth. They're interesting, of course, because they have a cell wall that's made out of biologically produced glass or silicon. And as a result, we can identify them. So we know what species are. They are microscopic organisms, and as a result are quite responsive to environmental changes that take place, whether that's changes in rivers, changes in lakes, changes in oceans. And because of that silica cell wall, they preserve very well. That's one of the ways that I use them, is as subfossils in sediment records in lakes. Finally, we've developed some really amazing tools to use diatoms to help us better manage our lakes and streams in this world. The other thing that I often am doing in terms of thinking of water quality is to use paleolimnology, which is the study of lake sediments, to reconstruct environments. At the bottom of every lake, there are sediments that have accumulated over tens and thousands, and if you go to the right lake, you can find millions of years of sediment that is accumulated. And we can go and we've got mechanisms for retrieving that sediment and essentially going back in time to determine how much and when a lake has changed. And it's become, in so much of our work, a sort of a critical tool for guiding management and lake restoration, lake management decisions. To take cores from bottom of lakes, we use all kinds of techniques. I was looking at this picture today and realized that the two lakes I'm going to talk about today, we've used 3 of the 4 of these techniques. Everything from what's called a Livingston core to a gravity core to a piston core to using oceanographic gear, box cores on lakes. If we can get a sediment up, we start analyzing it. Usually we first use some radioisotopes to figure out when sediments were deposited. These radioisotopes are sometimes natural, sometimes human-made. Lead-210 is our common one we use. If we go back in real longer histories in lakes, we often use carbon dating. From these dating records, we get a dating profile. We know that the top of the core is from a year ago or 2 years ago now. And as we go down the core, we know that that level of sediment in the core corresponds to essentially what that lake was doing at that time. Finally, we analyze a number of other things in sediment cores. These include all kinds of other biogeochemical clues that are preserved in sediment cores. And each of these gives us a history of what, or clues, I should say, of what has happened to that lake over time. It may be geological or erosion signals that are in that lake. It may have to do with nutrient cycling by looking at phosphorus. It may have to do with algae through both fossils, such as diatom fossils, or even algal pigments of things like, what were cyanobacteria were like in the past. We can look at pollen, we can look at plants, we can look at insect remains, and of course we've now even transitioned to looking at DNA in sediment cores. Diatoms are, of course, the most important thing that's in sediment cores. That might be a little bit biased on my part, but they have these well-preserved fossils, and we've developed models that allow us to predict what phosphorus levels were in a lake. So if we want to go back 200 years, we can look at the diatoms that were preserved and provide a real good estimate of what that diatom community probably represented in terms of that lake's history. And we're going to use this tool along with all these other paleolimnological tools in the two studies I'm going to talk about, and how we develop these partnerships. For example, in the state of Minnesota, we analyzed a whole bunch of lake sediment cores from throughout some of the 8 different ecoregions that the state has, where we studied the top of the core to understand its modern conditions, and then we sampled below the Euro-American settlement horizon to sort of get back to some background levels. From these data, we both developed the models that we use to predict what historical conditions were with diatoms. And number 2, we were able to compare modern conditions to what conditions were like before. And from these data, the state of Minnesota proposed standards by which we might use to evaluate our lakes. For example, in the Northern Lakes and Forest region, we expect and anticipate that lakes might stay below 30 parts per billion or 30 micrograms per liter total phosphorus. Well, with that sort of toolkit that I carry around, let me jump to the actual problems that we're facing. We're going to talk about 2 large lakes that are located right up on the international border, near the international border. The one is Lake of the Woods, and about 100 kilometers, 60 miles south of that, are Upper and Lower Red Lakes. Both of these lakes are amazing, support amazing fisheries. We have visions of these lakes as being, destinations. But when you look between those types of pictures, you see that there are some problems in these lakes. They throw periodic cyanobacterial blooms that can be pretty intense. The other thing to recognize in these 2 bodies of water is that our watersheds are multi-jurisdictional. In Lake of the Woods, we recognize that there's a border of Minnesota and Canada. There's provincial borders of Ontario, Manitoba. There are many, many First Nation groups. There are also tribal groups on the US side. On the northwest angle is part of the Red Lake tribal lands. And that bringing these people together is probably an important thing in how we think about moving forward in managing these types of systems. And the Red Lake Nation is a sovereign nation that oversees most of the Upper and Lower Red Lake management and their management issues. We'll come back to both of these now. So let's start with Lake of the Woods. So what's the problem with Lake of the Woods? Lake of the Woods has a long history of pollution. Its main inflow is the Rainy River, which was a major industrial and logging thing, where there were huge amounts of things such as sawdust that were dumped into the water, as well as, of course, towns along the way utilizing it for sewage disposal. There's been a long history of monitoring it, and in the upper left of your screen, you can see that main phosphorus load to the lake from the Rainy River has decreased since the 1970s pretty significantly. We recognize, as I pointed out before, that this is a multi-jurisdictional water body. There's many different groups that have jurisdiction in this thing. And the other thing that has happened is that this lake is impaired for nutrients and chlorophyll. The state of Minnesota put the case together and proposed it to the US EPA, and it has been approved. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. Even with that decrease of phosphorus load, we've still seen an increased frequency, extent, and export of blue-green algal blooms moving up into the Canadian side of the lake, and as well as toxins being produced. We've had dog deaths and things like that on this lake. The monitored nutrient trends are a little bit unclear, and we really needed, in thinking about this lake, trying to understand how this phosphorus load and cycling was occurring in its lower lake and its effect on what we monitor. The answer to some of these questions, not all of them, are in the sediments. And we initiated a project where we took 7 primary sediment cores from throughout the lake. They typically were these about 1 meter long piston cores, with the need to understand that P loading and cycling and its effect on our lake biology. From these data, we developed a historical phosphorus budget of the lake to understand its history and what we might envision its future. All the cores were dated with that lead-210, and we measured all kinds of biogeochemistry, including fossil pigments, diatoms, phosphorus fractions, biogenic silica, etc. What did we learn from our work on Lake of the Woods? I mean, we could do an entire seminar on just what we learned from the sediments of Lake of the Woods, and I'm just going to try to hit some of the high points and how, again, these data have led to future management plans that have really fostered partnerships in the long run. First thing we learned is that we've understood what the pre-degradation condition, what this lake used to be like 150 years ago. We learned where all the sediment was deposited in the lake. We learned what the importance of that sediment was in terms of its cycling and how it was continuing to cycle nutrients after decades and decades of nutrient loading. We identify this sediment that's tied, or these nutrients that are tied up in the sediments as legacy nutrients. And what we ended up doing was modeling a historical phosphorus budget for the lake, where we could predict what we think the future of this lake will be in terms of how the sediments are going to impact water column total phosphorus. The result output of the model was down in the lower right, where we saw major increases during the heavy loading period. And then once things like the Clean Water Act got initiated and had some industrial and municipal controls, we've dropped the sediment, the water column total phosphorus has been dropped off significantly. But this work is only one piece of the puzzle that we have. Come on. Based on this work, the work we did, as well as many, many, many others, it was determined first that Lake of the Woods was impaired, and it was listed as impaired by Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the US EPA. And what, of course, this does is initiate the TMDL process that we're all familiar with. And the TMDL process, which was coordinated by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, brought together data, information from 30 contributors. These included state, tribal, university, consultants, NGOs, federal agencies, and even Canadian partners to develop the first TMDL for Lake of the Woods. That TMDL was going to focus on continuing reduction of nutrients and blue-green algal blooms. The sediment data and the models that we worked were key components to it, but so was understanding the water quality, where tribal groups, including the Red Lake Nation, State agencies and local agencies were contributing to that. And it became the first nutrient management plan for this amazing lake. This, of course, putting together a plan means you got to do something with it. And one of the things that we initiated in conjunction with the Red Lake Department of Natural Resources and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is Lake of the Woods effectiveness monitoring. We put together a program where we would get out there twice a month for doing sampling. We were sampling water quality. We were sampling cyanobacterial toxins. We deployed high frequency buoys in the lake. And we even get out there once a year to check what winter conditions are like. The information we're gaining from these effectiveness monitoring strategies are really important. For instance, these buoys that we've deployed show how this huge lake, which is the southern basin, is almost 50 miles across, actually stratifies in the summer and goes anoxic at the bottom, causing nutrients to be released from the sediments under those conditions, which eventually fuel these blooms. This is, of course, how some of this legacy phosphorus is getting cycled in this lake. Other work, the actual bi-monthly thing is another partnership between the research station and the Red Lake DNR, where we swap out going back and forth to hit the stations and participate in this effectiveness monitoring program. Well, that was briefly how partnerships developed up on Lake of the Woods. I want to move now about 60 miles south to the Red Lakes. Upper and Lower Red Lake are part of the Red Lake Nations, Red Lake Sovereign Nations, contiguous reservation boundaries, and they encompass most of Upper and Lower Red Lakes, and they have tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction over their management. The eastern half of Upper Red Lake is currently under the jurisdiction of the state of Minnesota. And for many, many years, the Red Lake DNR has managed Upper and Lower Red Lake, recognizing that this is a shallow, naturally very productive and eutrophic system that supports an amazing tribal and sport fishery in it. When we look at the watershed itself, it is not very developed. It's mostly peatland, forest. It doesn't have large cities, large tracts of agricultural lands that might be some of the more typical drivers of any sort of nutrient-driven water quality issues. As part of their strategy, the Red Lake DNR has been monitoring many stations in Upper and Lower Red Lake for the last 20 plus years. The data are summarized here in the box plots on the left. The Lower Red Lake is in the column on the left, Upper Red on the right. And you'll see that, number one, there's not a huge amount of variability within each basin. That Upper Red Lake is a little more productive. It's got a little more phosphorus, a little more chlorophyll, and little less water clarity compared to compared to Lower Red Lake. Oops. And secondly, I've imposed over this graph the water quality standards for the state of Minnesota has proposed for the Northern Lakes and Forest ecoregion, where we can see that currently the Red Lakes don't meet the standards that the state of Minnesota has put together for this that would suggest for this body of water. one of the ways that we might consider thinking about this is to understand the longer term history of this lake. So the Red Lake DNR partnered with the research station on a sediment coring project where we took sediment cores from throughout both basins of the lakes, learned some really interesting things. Number one, we learned that the eastern half of the upper lake is such a high energy system that it doesn't accumulate sediments in a conformable way. So we can't take sediment cores that reflect a history of the lake. We did use the other sediment cores, and they formed a part of one of my graduate student, David Burge's one of the main chapters of his dissertation. And he analyzed all kinds of these different things that we analyze in sediment cores. And what we found was that the history of upper and lower Red Lakes suggests there's just very subtle changes in lake productivity and the algal communities in this lake, whether it was cyanobacteria, diatom communities, or changes in organic accumulation in these lakes, suggesting that there haven't been radical changes in the last couple hundred years in the upper and lower Red Lakes. We show that there is evidence of nutrient cycling. For instance, there's iron-bound phosphorus at the top of the sediment columns that are obviously is in play in terms of cycling of nutrients in these lakes. And one of the key pieces of evidence was with the diatoms, and it showed both a very little community change over time in these lakes compared to what we expect in lakes that have been hit pretty hard. And number two, when we used our models to reconstruct historical phosphorus in these lakes, it showed that there really wasn't much change. There really wasn't any evidence of change in these lakes. So with these studies and sort of moving ahead, what do we do with this? And in approaching this, we partnered our work with the Red Lake DNR, with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, to try to see how we might think about approaching these Red Lakes. And what we're doing is compromising to promote site-specific standards for the Red Lakes. Now we're still in discussion, which means the manuscript is still in prep, but we're getting close to agreement on proposing some standards that might be used in these lakes. Not quite sure whether the upper lake and lower lake should have different standards or a single standard for the two lakes, as well as tweaking a little bit of how we're approaching this project. But we're getting close to coming to agreement where we can understand how an effective partnership can really benefit everyone. What I'd like to do now is just offer a little bit of thought about what, from kind of my perspective, I hope other people's perspectives as well, as to what makes these kind of partnerships work. For me, it's a time when when I signed up for science, I didn't realize that this was going to be part of what we had to do. I thought it was just like, hey, get out there, do some stuff, work really hard, come up with answers. And what I have quickly realized is that when you approach multi-jurisdictional things, that we need to think about this in a lot of ways. We need to understand that sovereignty, whether it's tribal or other groups, must be considered. That jurisdictional boundaries are important to recognize, and that's the only way that that can result in some effective partnerships. So I want to offer just a few thoughts about what I think is an effective partnership. So first is recognition. One of the groups that we've all been involved with it puts out a state of the basin report every few years, and just a month ago, the third edition of this report came out, and in there I thought the authors, which included contributions from 25 of us that were all involved in this, made clear that we must be determined to respect the multi-jurisdictional nature of basins by highlighting indigenous knowledge systems and to illustrate how Western and indigenous systems can work together to help solve our resource issues. And this was the first time that this kind of recognition had happened in our basin reports that I'm aware of. But I think it really does indicate the direction we need to be considering. Second, we all come at this with expertise in what we do. And one of the things that I think has been really fun in developing these partnerships is sharing that expertise, whether it's, you know, joining each other in the field and you know, showing everyone what we do and stuff, to, you know, going into the lab and talking about algal taxonomy and diatoms and cyanobacteria and things like that. I think that's been one of the real benefits of these programs, to be able to share our knowledge with one another. Second, or third, is, check if I missed one. No, is accessibility and acknowledgement. One of the things that I thought has been really neat with this amazing partnership between the Red Lake Band, our research station and Science Museum Minnesota, and a state agency, has been that we've all recognized this partnership as beneficial and as important. Red Lake DNR created a beautiful part of their newsletter, you know, showing how that partnership was working up on Lake of the Woods. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, when they released their TMDL, talked about how this was these partnerships, and we were working together to look at the effectiveness of this this program. And we've got social media that we each of our groups do that include things. And even during the midst of COVID, the Science Museum of Minnesota put together an activity that everyone could do while they were masked up and stuck at home, was to look at lakes. And we used as examples this partnership of how we were working with state and tribal groups to tackle these problems on our largest lakes. Last, I think, is communication. And something that I was introduced to was this one of the rare things that I find, which is a meeting forum, a meeting scenario that really allows for open communication to take place. And the one that works in this area is the Rainy Lake of the Woods Watershed Forum. It is a group that's met annually in early March since 2004. There's 100, 125 people show up for it, but it is this incredible one time of the year, just for a couple of days, when people come together to talk about these things in a very respectful and very open dialogue setting. And it involves, you know, crossing international borders and all these kinds of things. And it's actually been kind of sort of sad not to be able to participate in this forum in an in-person setting. We've been doing it virtually the last couple of years. And it was one of the last things we did before things got shut down in 2020, was to have this forum. The importance of it, I can illustrate in one way. I was at the forum one day, just talks had gotten done, and I was walking by and I looked down at Shane, who works for the Red Lake Tribal DNR. I saw his name tag and it said Red Lake Tribal DNR. And I said, hey Shane, nice to meet you. I submitted a proposal to Red Lake 15 years ago. Never really got any legs with it, never really heard anything. And he said, hey, I just read that yesterday. we should work on that. We should get together. And so it's the kind of thing where a place for this kind of open communication really works to get people in the same room talking together to, again, solve problems. And it's how we got involved with working with the Red Lake. Finally, is this communication needs to be respectful. So, don't be afraid to ask what the best way to do things are, what the best way to say things are. With these and any projects, always ask about where the data is going to go, what the sharing, what publications, how can this stuff be, how can we partner in doing this? Utilize local knowledge and never assume in these projects. And last, know when you need help. That help is sometimes expertise, that different people have different skill sets to approach problems. It's why we came into this with expertise in sediment analysis, but it matters even bigger than that. The last time that we went out, or no, I shouldn't say the last time. In 2019, in October, late October of 2019, we went out to do our last water quality sampling and pull our buoys. We got to the lake first thing in the morning. It was 17 degrees out. That's Fahrenheit. We could put in our boat on the west side of the lake and managed to pull our 2 buoys over there successfully. We were feeling pretty proud of ourselves. We trailered the boat around to the east side of the lake, and when we came out past the barrier islands, we were hit by a wall of water. The lake had come up. It was mean, it was violent, and there was no way the 21-foot boat we were on was going to handle what we needed to do. We turned around, headed back to the landing. On the way, we called Shane down at the Red Lake DNR and said, Shane, we just got completely blown off the lake. Any chance that you could come up tomorrow with your bigger and safer boat and help us out? And at 7 o'clock the next morning, he was in the parking lot. We went out. It was still cold. We still had to chip ice off our clothing, but we managed to get out there and get our buoys, only because, one, we knew when we needed help, and B, that help was available within this wonderful partnership that we had put together. And with that, I again want to acknowledge all the amazing people and partners that we've been able to work with over the years, and hope that people might have some discussion and or questions on this work.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was an excellent presentation, and thank you for sharing your experience and the things you learned from those experiences of creating partnerships and maintaining those partnerships. We have questions. Folks, please feel free to add your questions in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and ask Mark a question. I'll just start off with the one in the chat. Question is, how did the Science Museum get involved in monitoring in an area so far away from the metro and St. Croix River? In other words, who reached out first to start this project?
Believe it or not, it started because of, we actually, back in the 2000s, worked upstream in the watershed. We were working on near Voyageurs National Park, which is Rainy Lake and Lake Kabetogama and Lake Namakan, and we had a project there. And the USGS guy, who was my program officer, invited us, to, hey, you should come to this forum. And I showed up, and it was eye-opening. We had done a lot of work on sort of boundary water issues in the past, on the Minnesota-Wisconsin border waters, and it intrigued me enough that I sat in lots of meetings and we started having conversations, and pretty soon you get to know people and realize that these different skill sets and different analytical tools and things like that can be put together to really solve these issues. That's how we ended up working so far away from home.
Great. Folks, feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question verbally. Mark, I was curious for the Lake of the Woods. You went through that whole process of having the lake listed as impaired, then the TMDL process, and then now you're monitoring the effectiveness. How long will that continue? How do you maintain that? And does funding come from both the US and Canadian side to support those efforts?
I'm inclined to actually ask someone else who should be on this to speak up. I'll try to address it, and maybe if Jesse Anderson is on, he can open up and talk. But in general, we've set up this effectiveness monitoring program to basically track how well the TMDL is working, and whether or not we're making progress towards our goals, which is having decreased nutrient loads, decreased algal abundance, increased or clearer water. I won't try to say increase or decrease second because it's so hard to figure that out. But it's a process that gets revisited, and in this situation, it is coming from, although the TMDL itself was supported by a much broader group of contributors and things. It's a U.S. side of the border type of a approach, since the EPA is the who approves that type of a TMDL. That being said, there is strong interest from on the Canadian side of the border as well to coordinate efforts in this. And again, that's one of the reasons that this small little forum that occurs once a year for 2 days is one of the most important things, because it gets all kinds of people in a room, people that are stakeholders from everywhere, whether it's Métis, First Nation, tribal, state, provincial, federal. Amazing ways to get, work together to get problems solved.
We have a hand raised by Sunny Cuffey. Go ahead, Sunny.
Yes, my question is, I've seen what looks like to be diatoms on turtles. Do you know have you seen that, or what does it mean?
All right, freshwater turtles or sea turtles?
Yes, freshwater.
Freshwater turtles, yeah. There's Sylvia and I have both worked with a student who went through Oklahoma and ended up in Texas, who worked a lot on diatoms that grow on turtles. And turns out there's a very interesting flora that grows on turtles, and that isn't just limited to freshwater turtles, but also in the marine world. There's actually species of diatoms that are essentially endemic to living on some of the swimming animals, whether it's the turtles, the manatees, or other large marine mammals.
Is it a concern, or it's just a natural occurrence?
I think it's a natural occurrence. It's algae finding a nice place to live that they can tolerate a little bit of the time when the turtles get out and they can dry out. So we typically find oftentimes some of the diatoms are things that are much more commonly found in soil because they can tolerate drying out a little bit. They're not, your garden variety found in the water diatom, but special floras that are more accustomed to living on soil habitats that might dry out. So it's a cool community that lives on turtles.
Thank you.
All right, more questions here in the chat. Curious if you can share some examples of indigenous knowledge that has contributed to the project.
No. I think in terms of the indigenous knowledge, it's primarily our understanding of the history of the Red Lake, that within both based on monitoring and traditional knowledge, that the understanding of this lake is that it's been a naturally productive system, productive for some algae sometimes, of course, but also for an amazing fishery that supports a commercial fishery for the tribe, the Red Lake Nation, and that knowledge in itself is really part of the impetus of this, of understanding that the understanding being that this lake is known to be productive, and that in moving forward with it, we may not want to call it impaired. And I think the data that we've shown ends up supporting that that we have shown through long-term monitoring and from historical work that this is a lake that's naturally productive. Sylvia, will you please call on Shane?
Yes, I call on
my,
Shane.
Hey, this is Shane from Red Lake. I wasn't actually raising my hand to chime in on this particular question, but we have spent some time speaking to the community, finding out from elders what the history of the lake was like, whether or not people remember it being green ever, or specifically not clear. And certainly that seems to align with the data that we've collected. But actually I raised my hand because I don't have a question, but I just wanted to first thank Mark for a really great presentation. Second, thank you to Mark and Adam and everyone at the Science Museum for what has been a really wonderful partnership. And throughout this process, as Mark has learned and Adam have learned to sort of navigate a partnership amongst a multitude of entities, both at Lake of the Woods and at Red Lake, we have learned also. I mean, I have learned things about tribal sovereignty because of very thoughtful and nuanced questions that Mark has asked me throughout this process. So I just want to say I really appreciate that, and you guys have been amazing partners to work with.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank you for your comments. Mark, do you think that having an entity like the Red Lake DNR, the fact that the Red Lake Nation had a DNR, was that an important factor in being able to develop these partnerships for your research?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the Red Lake DNR has prioritized bringing in or developing expertise to address their resource issues. And I think it is through the fact that they have a Red Lake DNR that is both actively monitoring, actively managing, actively approaching these research issues, is absolutely key to this. And again, as Shane said, and I just head right back into Shane's world, is that it's been an absolute pleasure to develop these partnerships and work together.
And following up on that, if it's okay, Shane or others on the call, do you have any advice for other nations, tribes who want to develop a DNR?
Shane wasn't around at the inception of the DNR, so that's a kind of a deep-reaching question. And tribes are very unique in both their interests and their needs and their capabilities. And I guess what I would say, if there are tribes that are interested in working on areas in which Red Lake has some expertise, feel free to reach out, and we would be more than happy to help. We're currently trying to help some tribes understand continuous monitoring in lakes and streams. We're helping other tribes work on developing ways to work within the 303D program, which is the Impaired Waters program through EPA. So I think and we're not special in that way. I think there are a lot of tribes out there with expertise that are more than willing to help tribes get up and running, and many of them much more skilled in these areas than we are.
Thank you for letting me put you on the spot there. Another question I had was, it was really great to see that you have students and young people, receiving training and being part of this project. How did those students get involved? And if there are folks interested, how do they get involved?
That sounds like another one for me. Maybe Mark will weigh in a little bit too. Red Lake actually has a tribal intern program that we run. It's not every year because it's dependent on funding, but we do our best to bring students into something called a tiered mentoring program, which is where we'll take, for example, a student who's in high school, another student who's in maybe a 2-year tribal college, another that's an undergraduate at a 4-year college, and then a graduate student. And we try and work them all together so that they sort of get that mentorship from the next level of education. So we brought them in that way. And I don't know if you can go back in your images there, Mark, but there are a couple of students that were interns there, one of which is Joshua Jones, who is now our tribal hydrologist and has been for a few years. So he started here as an intern, worked his way through a 4-year degree, and was able to move into a professional position here at Red Lake DNR. So we're pretty proud of that.
Excellent.
He's got his back to us in that lower left-hand photo there.
Great picture.
Because he's looking in a microscope, right, Sylvia?
Of course. Another question that I had was, compromise as a word that came up a few times in your presentation. Could you provide some examples where, more specific examples of that compromise, and perhaps it was about like how you interpret the data, or I don't know, even maybe method of sampling, or the number you get for the water quality standard at the end. Could you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think from my feelings about the compromise is that it stems from the fact that we come at this with different perspectives and different levels of expertise. So for instance, from our shop, we were primarily working with the sediment records to understand how the Red Lakes, or Lake of the Woods in that case, had changed over time. And so we brought a set of information, a set of data, and the Red Lake DNR brought a set of information, a set of data of their findings on the lake, including our indigenous knowledge. And the state Minnesota Pollution Control Agency brought their expertise to the table. And I mean, sometimes it has to happen over Zoom, sometimes it happens at a forum, but in the end, it's a conversation that's occurring, that looking for a path forward that's going to truly benefit all the parties involved in this. And I think that's really what the sort of the key of this type of a partnership is that we want everyone to be able to go home with a smile on their face.
All right. Let's see. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Am I missing any hands that have been raised, or other folks who want to ask a question or provide comments? Okay, we have a question Was the state agency receptive to this collaboration from the beginning?
From my perspective, I would say yes. I don't know if Shane or Kayla is willing to offer up their perspective. But
I can offer a slightly different perspective.
Okay. Thanks, Shane.
Well, and only because of the way in which this partnership started was that the state wanted to list Red Lake as impaired, largely because the state doesn't have the extensive data set that we do. They had only a couple years of data and their large ecoregion standards to compare it to. And so, looking at those standards and looking at the lake data, according to their assessment methodology, the lake didn't meet standards and they wanted to list it. The tribe then went on record saying, we disagree, we don't think this should be listed. And essentially, we made a lot of noise. And because of that, the EPA agreed to help us find some funding to fund a paleo study to find out who was right. And so I think from that point forward, the state was very receptive. And once we got past the question of whether or not to list the lake immediately, the state has been a really good partner. And I will add to that the fact that all of the technical staff at the MPCA have forever been excellent partners. The only disagreements we've had have been people far up the chain of command.
Thank you, Shane.